On the heels of President Trump using disparaging imagery to describe African nations, new tapes have just been released by the National Archives that reveal similar language used by the late President Ronald Reagan. So let me take you back to 1971, and it was Reagan, who was, by the way, the governor of California at the time, was on the phone with then President Richard Nixon. And so during this conversation, Reagan referred to leaders of African nations as, quote, monkeys, and then President Nixon gets in his own dig. Here you go.
And last night, I tell you, to watch that thing on television as I did,
yeah,
to see those monkeys from those African countries, damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes.
Well, and then the tail wags the dog there, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The tail wags the dog.
Tim Naftali is a CNN presidential historian and former director of the Nixon Presidential Library. And Tim, there's a lot to get through here. But let me just start with, what's the backstory? How did you get your hands on this tape?
Well, the National Archives has been reviewing Nixon tapes since the 1980s. Richard Nixon sued the National Archives for control of his tapes. That led to a court case. That led to a whole different review. I became director of the Nixon Library in 2007. By that point, the review had gotten to November of 1972, and by court order, we were supposed to go in chronological order. The chronological review ended in 2013. National Archives then did, I was no longer there, but I have a sense of what was done. The National Archives then went to some very important preservation work on the tapes, digitized them, and then they started a re-review. They went back to the redactions, the withdrawn parts from the earliest tapes. And I learned, again, now as a private researcher, that private researchers could request certain conversations. Now, when I was at the National Archives, I heard that there was a racist conversation between Ronald Reagan, which was a surprise, and Richard Nixon, which was not a surprise. Now, I didn't hear the conversation. It wasn't part of my job to go back and listen to it. But I made a point to finding out if someone had requested it. No one had requested it. And so I requested, I didn't know exactly which one it would be, but I requested the Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon conversations last year, just after I heard that the National Archives was doing these reviews. And they released them this summer. And they released them at a very interesting time. It's a coincidence, but given our national conversation about presidential racism, I think this conversation is really important for Americans to listen to. It raises uncomfortable questions.
Yeah. Among those uncomfortable questions, obviously questions about President Reagan's legacy. I want to read this. This is from the Reagan Foundation. This is what they tweeted out today. We can preserve the dream of America. We need all our people, men and women, young and old, individuals of every race, to be happy, healthy, and whole. And that is what our job is all about. How do you think this will affect the legacy of Ronald Reagan?
Well, I want to raise 2 points. It's very important that the Reagan Foundation endorses that view of this country. What is troubling is that sometimes our political leaders privately do not believe their public rhetoric. I am not a Reagan specialist. I've written about him, but largely with regard to foreign policy. I leave it to the Reagan biographers to see whether this poison that we see in this conversation runs throughout his career. Why does it matter? I'm not interested in future Mount Rushmores. In other words, I'm not looking to raise up certain leaders and bring others down. What I'm worried about is the poison of racism shaping American policy, shaping the way in which we deal with ourselves. And given the concerns today about the racially tinged, some of it, but racist language, some of it too, of our head of state, I think these are questions we have to ask. Because in Nixon's time, he allowed his views of African Americans to shape his policies at home and abroad. And that was bad for this country. And I worry that our current head of state is doing the same.
We'll leave it, as you said, to the Reagan biographers, but all those Americans, who obviously have their own thoughts and admiration for this late president, Tim Naftali. You have the tape. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing it.
Thank you, Brooke.
Ahead here in Detroit, I will speak live with a candidate who got the most Google searches last night, Marianne Williamson.